Madinvar. Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm from SIL, which I guess some of you might be familiar with and some of you probably won't. So I'll fill in a little bit about who I work with. This is actually two authors on the thing. Dave, there he is. That's as far as we'll see him today. He is really the developer of what I'll be ending up talking about, the language and identity journey. So yeah, so good to. So the topic of the conference being rooting minority language policy in the speaker community, that really rung bells with me, because in SIL, and I'll tell you who we are in a moment, I think we're trying to move in a similar direction. That language policy, we are an organization which has worked with over 1,000 minority language communities, minoritized. And I think we're still learning an awful lot about how to work best with communities. So this is going to cover some of what we've learned along the way and what can we learn as we move forward. And that's one thing I've really enjoyed, listening to the discussions from a community-led event here. So there's the front page, well, it was a few days ago, of our website, particularly focused on language-related barriers. And about 25% of the world's population have significant barriers because of language. They have difficulty accessing justice, for example. I was just talking with the MSP, Alistair, on the first evening, saying he'd been to Malawi and courts are in English, which is not necessarily a language the majority of the population understand. Education, all sorts of issues. So, as I mentioned, we've worked with well over 1,000 communities around the world. Our engagement in Europe has probably been less than any other part of the world. So, yeah, we have less experience of the type of context you're dealing with here. We're a faith-based organization. Much of what we do, one of our most famous activities is in Bible translation, also other literacy materials and literacy programs as well. But those probably in most, not 100% of the places we've worked have been involved. But also other things in context. Sometimes we help run bilingual or multilingual education programs with the government. Sometimes we're involved in publishing a whole range of materials. And sometimes we get involved in community development and so on. But you could argue that language development is a form of community development. And that depends very much on the context that we're working with. Now, as we look back, the work started back in the 1930s. Materials that have been produced have been well used, taken up by the community in some cases, and largely neglected in others. And there's a spectrum there. That's a lot of learning. And one of the things that's been going on, some colleagues of mine, Paul Lewis and Gary Simons, who've been mentioned, their definition of community-based language development was given on the first evening. They have led a study of what have we learned, what seems to, if I use work, what is effective in working with minority language communities. And this resulted in something that we're calling the sustainable use model, which is a model for how do we help communities, work with communities to maintain sustainable use of their language in particular domains and for particular purposes. And to pass this knowledge on to anybody who wants to work with minority communities. Now, of course, things work slightly differently in different contexts. And one of the things is that the situations that we work with are widely variable. Some situations, there is ongoing language shift. In others, there isn't. In some, there's incipient language shift. The reaction that makes sense in those different contexts will be different. So, one of the key findings, which isn't necessarily totally brand new, but if we want to look at language maintenance, that the fact that the language will continue to be passed on within the community to future generations, The necessary condition, not a sufficient condition, is intergenerational transmission of the vernacular. Now, if that's in place, other activities such as literacy, signage, music, a whole bunch of cultural activities may well assist in strengthening the vitality of the language. But one of the major findings is if a language is being lost in the fact that communities are not passing on the language to the next generation, producing books and all sorts of other activities doesn't actually change that. And that's one of the mindsets that we often come up against. And it's an often natural reaction. A community will say, and I've heard this kind of phrase, we want a Bible or we want a New Testament so our language will be saved. Now that word of saving a language, it's kind of interesting. What do people mean? And they mean all sorts of things. I think that might, and there's a perception that if something is produced, somehow the children might start speaking the language again. But that doesn't tend to be what influences children to speak a language. It tends to be the surrounding environment. So that's maybe the number one finding. And now that's not drastically new. Joshua Fishman was saying much the same thing, many same things beforehand. But that's at the center of the sustainable use model. I'm going to introduce a term which please feel free to forget, but EGITS is a language vitality scale, also introduced by Lewis and Simons. And they took Fishman's scale, which was GIDS, this is the extended GIDS, and decided that there should be a split at level 6, which is where children are learning a language. Well, the question is, how many children are learning a language? If all, or a recent amendment, which hasn't yet been published, if at least 85% of children are actively learning the language, then we can describe the language as vigorous. And we would pair that with sustainable orality. The orality of the language, the fact that it's spoken by the community, is sustainable and can go on for future generations. Of course, it's no guarantee. Things can always change. Situations change, motivations change. And then there's the threatened stage, which is where fewer than 85% of the children are learning the language. Now, that actual figure, in the research here on Scots Gaelic and in Irish, Cropper and others have come up with figures of around a fall off below 67 to 70%. Those are the right figures, aren't they? It would be terrible to misquote you. So, but anyway, but that's currently what we're saying. So now, just because fewer than 85% of children are learning a language now doesn't mean no one will learn it in the following generation. But it does mean that there is a situation which is not easily sustainable. It's open to the risk of collapse soon. So those are two very different trajectories, and maybe just 15% of children or 20% difference that shows something. Why are those children not learning the language? And I'm not actually talking about situations where one or two families don't speak the language to their children, because some of those where the vast majority of parents are, the children will often learn the language from their peers. What is the language of the playground? The language of the playground may be perhaps a better indicator than what families say they are doing. That's not a major claim. It's just, it's something interesting to observe. So, and this can be troubling. And many of the communities that we work with, it's often the case that people don't necessarily see the loss that's going on around them. There may well be a value that our children speak our language because they're a member of our community and they will learn it. No one taught it to me, I just picked it up. And yet with a changing dynamic of another language becoming dominant, that mechanism doesn't necessarily work in the same way. And so many of the conversations with communities are trying to help them see what their situation is. So here, the book from which this is taken is called Sustaining Language Use. You can get it online. I think it was $13 plus tax last time I looked. Or you can also buy it, a physical copy. And this book, which is an academic tome, provides the concepts and model for community-based language development, looking at different stages of language vitality and language development. So it also looks at the introduction of literacy, which it would say ongoing sustainable literacy needs to have generally a base of sustainable orality. And what are realistic goals? So someone, I can't remember who, said we need to celebrate the small successes. I heard that phrase yesterday. And this is one way to look at small successes. What steps can we make? And I'll give you an example of one or two of those in a few moments. And which levels of EGITS are sustainable? There are also something, I won't go through the details, called the famed conditions, the 5 famed conditions. So when you look at a certain level of language, what are the conditions which are necessary or helpful to maintain that particular level? One is the functions of the language. So what is it used for? Is it used for speaking, for writing, etc., etc.? Acquisition, what is the system of acquisition of this language? Generally, for orality, that's the home. The school can support that. Generally, for literacy, that would be the school. There are exceptions to that as well. I've been doing some research recently, and one of our case studies was a small group in Brazil of 200 people where literacy is transmitted in the family. Quite interesting. It's seen as part of raising your children. Then there's motivation. What are the motivations? And motivation is one of those things which you can't actually see. It's more difficult to measure. But we find that in some situations, the language might well be vital, but the motivation about the language is actually can, in some cases, be quite low. It's just there's no other choice. That is a situation where the dynamics change of surrounding languages, access to education in another language. If the motivation is low, you might see rapid language shift in such a situation. One which the community has the least control over is the broader environment. Not that the community has no control or influence, rather. So what is government policy? We have found that some governments are very open to education in the vernacular, and other governments are very opposed, and other governments really don't care. So there's a whole range of policy environments, and also I think something that's been mentioned here, a written policy does not necessarily mean the same as what actually happens in practice. So the environment looks at that. And then differentiation. When I teach this is often the hardest concept to get hold of, but it has some great examples. Paper yesterday about Irish speaking kindergartens, nurseries in the Gaeltacht saying this is Irish only, don't use English in this space. That's a good example of differentiation. We use our language here, and the other language may be used for other purposes, but not here. There's a safe space for the language. That's one of the principles generally, because if there isn't a safe space, what's to stop the other language coming in, which might well be seen as more prestigious and being used in other environments? That's a very brief summary of those 5 factors. Now, this is quite a reasonably academic tone. I teach on a master's program and we go through this book, but it may be not the best book to give out to a community where most people haven't gone beyond primary school. So which I gather is not the case here. Alongside it was developed something that hasn't been formally published, but is totally available, a guide for planning the future of our language, which is a guide for a facilitator to work with a local community Ideally, it was designed that the local community could use it itself. We found that hasn't really worked generally, unless you have a very highly motivated and well-educated member of that community. And it gets rid of much of the theoretical vocabulary. It doesn't talk about EGITS levels, but it does try to get the similar concepts across. People do a whole variety of activities, such as mapping out the village and showing which language they speak in which place. It's available also in a couple of other languages, French, Spanish, and Turkish. So, for example, rather than saying, here are the EGITS levels, the mountain, what we're calling the mountain metaphor, has been used. And we have the sustainable levels. So here it would be 6A, the language is spoken by all children. That's a sustainable level. And there you can rest and stay in your tent. But if it's spoken by some children, the natural tendency is it's going to go down, and it takes an awful lot of effort to go up. Now, we found 1 or 2 communities where they don't have mountains. This really doesn't work. But still, so need to sometimes develop different metaphors and so on for working effectively with communities. And then there might be a language which isn't spoken as a vernacular, but it's used as a symbol of identity. And one of the things that I personally find troubling, but I also understand, is we have a conversation with the community. Where do you want your language to be? It's possible, but in some communities, they want it down here. Most tend to want to go up. But we need to have a conversation about that. So there are workshops, and generally there have been probably around 100 workshops or so been rolled out with different communities. First, you find interested parties, and then there's been a week-long workshop with various activities, looking at establishing what the situation is, deciding on what the hoped-for future of the language is. So, what is the plan? Where do you want to get to? And then formulating a plan for the next steps, with a bit of a review of. Actually, it was 84, I think, of those workshops. Generally, only the first step was achieved, of seeing where we are. Actually putting together a plan and then implementing it tended not to happen. Now, there was actually progress, but it wasn't the hoped for progress. There's a pre-publication draft of a book which reviews 6 cases of the implementation of this workshop, probably slightly more positive ones than average. That's what tends to happen. From these countries, 2 cases from Cameroon. And here's a quote from Dave Eberhardt. Of the 84 communities that had applied the guide, this is a few years ago, only 6% of them reported having any positive results in language use. However, let's take a positive example from Pakistan. And I won't read the whole quote out, but basically, a workshop looking at 6 languages in the Northwest Frontier. The step that was taken following the workshops was to expand the use or introduce the use of social media in these languages. And social media is actually a really good place for a lot of this because it's new and it's often quite a conversational space, and vernaculars tend to be vehicles of conversation. So that is one of the things. So Facebook page with over 8,000 members, YouTube channels, and so on. So the workshop helps stimulate people to do that kind of thing. Now, this brings me to the language and identity journey, where what can we do about this? We're only seeing 6% of them actually making any difference. One of the changes, still using the same activities, was to have a greater focus on community leaders rather than just activists. Try and get whoever are seen as community leaders involved in the project. And rather doing a 1-week workshop and then going away, it's let's have a weekend to introduce and then make it more of a consultative experience, but also have an expectation that those community leaders will do some of the organizing of the follow-up events. And we've only done about 3 or 4 of these yet, and the rollout was just happening before COVID. But the take-up and the initiative from the community seems to be much greater. I can't give you statistical proof as yet. It's far too early for that. And in many cases, the local community have said, okay, yeah, we'll organize the next event, we'll bring in some people, we'll make sure people are fed, etc., which I think basically says this is our deal. This is not some outsider who's trying to help us, which seems to be bringing something of a change in community ownership, which is obviously what we're wanting to work towards. So walking alongside the community rather than a quick train and go. These are the steps. An awareness raising may be done with different groups together, but when we get to the actual assessment, we probably want to separate groups, planning and implementation. One approach is also not just to look at the most local language, but to say, what other languages do you speak? How do you want to use them? How can they be useful? So a repertoire approach rather than just a language approach. So it's still early days, but we're wanting to learn and we're wanting to do better and wanting to see greater community engagement in this process of working alongside communities to help them decide the future of their language and help them to see what the dangers are, what the steps can be, and so on. So, thank you very much. Tach balev.